Rick Ross is one of the world's top cult expert, if not possibly the top expert. He has helped hundreds of people get out of cults. He's been featured in countless documentaries. He's even been sued into oblivion by Scientology and lived to tell the tale. You can get his book, Cults Inside Out: How People Get In and Can Get Out, anywhere where books are sold. I recommend Audible. I listened to his audiobook and I absolutely loved it. Please enjoy my interview with cult expert Rick Ross. Rick Ross, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Aaron. Nice to be with you here.
So I saw you on the Sean Ryan show. I saw you on my friend Natalie Webster's show. I'm not sure if I've seen you on Rogan. Have you ever done Rogan?
No, have not done Rogan.
I am very surprised because I don't know, but in my mind, it's you, one other person. I won't name anyone's names because I don't know who you're friends with or not friends with. But I mean, you're probably easily considered like the top 3 cult experts in the US, at least in my opinion. Are you allowed to say that?
Well, I've been called that. There have been various news outlets that have described me as the most prominent deprogrammer or a leading cult expert in the US and internationally. So yeah, that's kind of my moniker, or that's been how I've been described.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad we agree on that. So after I saw you on Natalie's show, I was like, I've got to talk to Rick. And so I downloaded your book on Audible and I listened to your book and I thought it was really interesting. And of course, you know, my history is in Scientology. I was essentially born and raised in Scientology. And I have always wondered, I've only spoken to one other cult expert to pick their brains on. In your opinion, how is Scientology different than all of these other cults? Because in many respects, well, I think part of your expertise is in helping people to understand what all of these groups have in common. Mm-hmm. What are the common characteristics and traits and behavior patterns and all that kind of stuff. But just to get it kickstarted, in your opinion, is there something that makes Scientology unique amongst all of these high control groups?
Yes, I think that Scientology has the distinction of being one of the most carefully organized systems of thought reform that I've ever seen, in my opinion. So in other words, L. Ron Hubbard was a kind of savant. He was a genius about one particular thing, in my opinion, which was controlling people, manipulating people. And the way in which he structured Scientology with its overlapping layers of control, people supervising, case review and the auditors and all of the notes taken, and just this incredible structure. It's like a machine that anyone that is processed through it, unless you bail, you're going to be controlled. And I think L. Ron Hubbard's genius was to construct that machine and to have, the ethics officer and the case management people and all these layers of control, and also to structure his courses and his training in a way that drew people deeper and deeper under the control of the organization. So that by the time you reach, OT3 and they tell you about Xenu, you don't care because you're that submerged in the subculture of Scientology and that much under the control of the system. And I think that was Hubbard's genius, other than certainly he was a charismatic leader and he had a certain panache, the ability to, just kind of glitter and pull people in and enthrall people with his, charismatic personality.
Yeah. By the way, if it looks like I'm looking off screen, it's because my notes are over here. And every time you're talking, I'm putting myself a little bullet point to follow up on. Okay. So that is amazing. I'll tell you, as on my route out of Scientology, there was a point where I did not actually understand the degree to which I was still holding on to the idea that there was something very special and unique about Scientology. Even though I no longer believed in it, I thought L. Ron Hubbard was a con man, full operating Thetan was a scam, it was a lie, and all that stuff. I didn't even realize I was holding on to this thing, but it's still a special type of bullshit, right? And I was reading this book that was a book similar to yours that was talking about the things cults have in common. And it was talking about recruitment tactics and all this stuff. Because I had heard about that book before I'd heard about your book. And I unexpectedly was having somewhat of an emotional breakdown reading this thing, just sobbing over something that really was not intended to evoke that type of emotional response. And it was the idea that I was like, oh no, I can't believe Scientology is just garden variety BS. And so when you talk about Scientology having this like almost extra sophisticated layers of control, and that Hubbard was an expert in that, I find that to be very interesting, because even though I've never been involved in these other cults, it certainly seems like Scientology's got some extra special BS on it. I mean, you've personally must have seen the tens of thousands of pages of policy volumes and technical bulletins on top of all the books and the lectures. I mean, you've seen the breadth of the stuff Hubbard wrote to control people in Scientology, right?
Well, I've actually been qualified, accepted, and testified as an expert witness in court proceedings regarding Scientology. And when Scientology's organization, Narconon, though Scientology would say, well, Narconon's independent, but really what Narconon is a faith-based cure-all for drug addiction, substance abuse. So basically what Narconon does is they teach you Scientology, and they use rituals like the Purification Rundown to cure you of whatever ails you in regards to substance abuse. Well, I was involved in one of those litigations, which was ultimately settled. And I actually had to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, because of the materials that were released through discovery that I had to review to prepare an expert witness report. Wow. And so what I was looking for, and what I look for typically when I testify in court, is what is the pattern of persuasion used by the group? How do they use coercive persuasion? How do they use thought reform? And Aaron, for the purpose of really getting to the nitty gritty of what makes a cult, in my book, Cults Inside Out, there's a chapter devoted to defining a destructive cult. And I go along with what Robert J. Lifton wrote in the 80s in a paper that was published at Harvard University titled Cult Formation. And in that paper, Lifton identified what I call the nucleus for virtually any definition of a destructive cult, which is number one, that there is an absolute authoritarian leader who has no meaningful accountability, that becomes an object of worship and is the defining element and driving force of the group. And then second, that leader knowingly uses systematically thought reform and coercive persuasion techniques to gain undue influence over his or her followers. And then finally, if it's to be seen as a destructive cult, the group does harm, and that varies by degree from group to group. So do those three core characteristics identify Scientology? In my opinion, they do. L. Ron Hubbard, now David Miscavige, being that absolute totalitarian leader that is an object of worship and is the core driving force of the group. And second, that the course curriculum, including the auditing, just all of the courses and the so-called spiritual counseling, all leads to conclude that Scientology is using thought reform and that they're using coercive persuasion. And then finally, because of all the complaints I've received and many other people are aware of, Scientology does harm to people's lives. This can be in their disconnection policy, where people leave and then they are shunned. This can be just simply like Lisa McPherson,
Mm.
who basically had a nervous breakdown, I believe, because of Scientology. And so Scientology, hurts people, in my opinion. And I think that's been written about very substantially and been testified about in court and so on. And so you take those three core characteristics: the all-powerful leader, thought reform, and people being hurt, and all the other definitions intersect that nucleus. And so that's how you can understand whether or not a group is a destructive cult.
I love it. I love it. And I heard you hit those precise points over and over and over again whenever you talk about this publicly. And I think that's so, it's so helpful, because you've got to give people things that they can use to identify these destructive cults. I want to ask you a question about kind of the, it's sort of laid out on a spectrum, right? You can have an authoritarian leader, but maybe they're not using thought reform. You can be using thought reform and coercive control, but maybe you're not doing harm, right? So you've got sort of these 3 points, and they progress sort of as you go through those points. I am reminded of, well, how do I put this shortly? This idea that you can have a cult, but it's not a destructive cult. I've heard this messaging from other people in the cult space, that it's not just about whether it's a cult, it's about whether it's destructive. And my question here is really, what are your thoughts on, is this, over time, has the meaning of the word cult changed or been diluted? Because it seemed before that cult itself, sort of just the word cult, kind of represented all of the 3 items that you just listed, that if you're a cult, that meant you're a destructive cult. How did we get to a place where you can be a cult, but not a destructive cult, if the question makes sense?
Okay, Aaron, what we're looking at then is such things as cult branding, cult following. That's different. So, for example, you have Taylor Swift. She has her Swifties. You have the old group, the Grateful Dead, and they had a following called the Deadheads. You have people that just absolutely are completely on board with Trader Joe's, and they always go shopping at Trader Joe's, or they're devoted to Apple products. And you could even say that certain corporate leaders, like when Steve Jobs was alive and leading Apple, that he was a kind of corporate cult leader. And there was a mindset that he promoted within the corporate culture of Apple. Mm-hmm. But he was paying people large salaries, giving them stock options, benefits. He wasn't really hurting people, and he was providing a product that the public used and wanted. So I think it's possible to have a cult following, or be a kind of celebrity that people are, enthralled with, and has a following, but yet not really be using thought reform or coercive persuasion in such a way that you're damaging people's lives. Yeah. So it is possible to have, in that sense, a benign cult. And then how do you measure whether or not a cult leader, and that's the single most salient feature of a destructive cult, is that all-powerful leader who is totalitarian, who has no accountability? How do you measure what that leader is doing? I think you look at Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. You look at those 8 criteria, such as milieu control, social isolation, or the demand for purity, or the loaded language filled with thought-terminating cliches. You go down that list of 8 and identify what is being done in that particular group and to what extent it's being done. And then also Edgar Schein, who was a professor of psychology at MIT, he wrote the book Coercive Persuasion. And there are 3 stages to coercive persuasion. Schein would describe the first stage as unfreezing, I would call it breaking people down.
Mm.
Second, you change them. And after you've broken them down and they're in this state of brokenness and they're saying, please, somebody help me to survive, help me to get better. And then you come with your formulated program and you say, this is the way to make you whole. This is the way to fix you. And you take it and you embrace it as a way out of the distress that you're now in. And then finally, Shine would say, comes the refreezing stage. And that is basically what I would call locking it in, locking it down. And how do you do that? That is in large part achieved through peer reinforcement, social isolation, where you're not really hearing other views, alternative ideas, and everyone in the group, which becomes your world that you inhabit, they're constantly reinforcing that change and whatever the group indoctrination is. So I think if you look at that, and then you can also read Robert Cialdini's book Influence.
What's his last name?
Pardon?
What's his last name?
Cialdini.
Okay.
Cialdini. Cialdini. He was a professor of psychology at Arizona State University, and he wrote a seminal book, Influence. And in that book, he identified the 6 principles of influence and how they could be used for good or for bad. For example, authority. We will obey people that we perceive to be in authority. Or liking, which is the basis of celebrity endorsements. We will buy something that's suggested by someone we like, or we will accept the guidance of people that we like. And that kind of couples with what we talk about in the cult phenomenon as love bombing. That is seemingly unconditional affection and regard when you become involved in the group, in order for you to like the people in the group and therefore be more malleable, be more responsive to what they want from you. And it's a form of manipulation, because for the people that are love bombing you, they understand that it's highly conditional and that their affection, their love of you is going to be withdrawn if you don't follow the path that they want you to follow.
That makes sense. I remember the first time I heard you mention the 3 steps of coercive persuasion, according to Robert Lifton: unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. And I was comparing those steps to the introductory routes into Scientology and then the major courses in Scientology. And I was struck by the fact that, in my opinion, someone has already gone through all of these steps. You have already entered refreezing by the time you've taken your first major Scientology course. And that's pretty remarkable. And again, I don't know how that compares to the onboarding experience of other cults. But to think that by the time you've taken your first major course in Scientology, you've already gone through all the steps of coercive persuasion was something that stuck in my head the first time I heard you describe those steps. You mentioned earlier that you were certified as an expert witness in Scientology. To my knowledge, the only other 2 people who have had that were perhaps Jesse Prince and Claire Headley. How did you go about, because you were never in Scientology, how did you go about getting to the point of being able to be certified as an expert witness?
Well, I have been accepted. I've been qualified, accepted, and testified as an expert witness in 13 states, including United States federal court. So it's a process. You are involved in a particular case. I've been involved in criminal cases, and personal injury claims, and a great many child custody cases where parents are going through a divorce and one parent is in a questionable group that might be called a cult, and the other parent is very concerned about their child being influenced by that group. And so there's a battle in child custody on the part of the parent who's not in the group, and by the parent who's in the group, over who is going to be in charge of that child and then indoctrinate that child. So what you do when you are qualified as an expert witness in court is you go through a process which is called voir dire, where you're questioned by opposing counsel. And I've been questioned by none other than Kendrick Moxon in voir dire. And a couple of times the judge told him, simmer down, because he was shouting and he was getting very, very upset and doing everything possible to try and get me upset. He questioned me for hours in voir dire, which is very unusual. And at the end, the judge ruled to qualify me despite his efforts. Later, that case was settled, which was a child custody visitation case. In my opinion, I think they settled it because they didn't want me to testify. And in fact, after that, Kendrick Moxon filed a motion for the judge to vacate the qualification, like it didn't happen.
Wow.
Because he was so concerned. But my point being,
wait, did that go through? Did they vacate it?
They vacated it, which means even though the judge did qualify me and accept me, it's kind of erases that, not in a negative sense, but just puts you back like you're standing on home plate, no strikes, no fouls, you're back to the beginning. But I have been qualified and accepted as an expert and testified regarding Scientology. And in the particular case that I was involved in with Narconon, I did not testify, but I was very deeply involved in analyzing the training and the course curriculum and everything that goes into bringing someone through the process of Scientology, which was being used through Narconon to understand how it matched up to coercive persuasion and thought reform. And I want to get back to something you said. I think that the definition of a destructive cult is getting a bit squishy these days. I mean, everybody is calling everybody else's group a cult.
Yes.
The woke movement is a cult. Donald Trump is a cult leader. Bernie Sanders is a cult leader. And it just goes on and on, each group calling the other group that it doesn't like a cult. But I think it's important for us to stay with the original understanding and the historical understanding of what a destructive cult is. And a destructive cult does not have a democratically elected leader who's accountable to the courts and to other branches of government. What a destructive cult has is a dictator, someone like David Miscavige, who seems to be ruling like a monarch with no meaningful accountability. And of course, L. Ron Hubbard ruled over Scientology in that same way preceding Miscavige. So what you have is a totalitarian form of governance. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel when we talk about cult indoctrination or how cults break people down and control them. I think we can look at the seminal work of Robert Cialdini, Influence. We can look at Edgar Schein, Coercive Persuasion, Robert J. Lifton, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And we can also look at the writings of Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman. They wrote the book Snapping, which was the first book about cults to identify information control. And then their second book, Holy Terror, identified what they call emotional control. So a lot of people like to, for marketing purposes, relabel other people's ideas and put together new ways of saying the same thing. But what I did in the book Cults Inside Out is I devoted an entire chapter to what is called cult brainwashing. And in it, rather than trying to relabel other people's ideas, I showed how they all connect together historically, and footnoted it very carefully so that people can understand where these ideas came from and how they coherently put together a picture of how destructive cults work.
Amazing. Coming from Scientology, I have sort of a baked in bias against these books talking about cults, meaning it's not something I struggle with. I just know that it's kind of like antidepressants. As a former Scientologist, I have this baked in bias against antidepressants, although I'm not antidepressant. Do you like, okay, so here's where I'm going with this, because it's going to sound like I'm pushing back on the cult education industry, but I'm not really. I'm just sort of exploring outside my comfort zone here. By the way, I might have misstated earlier that Robert Lifton wrote Coercive Persuasion, but you just said it was Edgar Schein. So if I misstated that earlier, I wanted to correct that. Would you say, Rob, who's like the grandfather, the great grandpappy of all of the cult education work? Is it Robert Lifton, or is there a big name that came before him?
I think that let's put this in historical context.
Okay.
Edgar Schein and Robert J. Lifton were writing about coercive persuasion and thought reform from the perspective of understanding what the North Korean communists did in POW camps in the late 50s. So that was where they were coming from. There was this Korean War, and there were American military people that were taken prisoner. Now, by the way, Margaret Singer, an eminent psychologist, clinical psychologist, and an educator who taught at UC Berkeley, she worked from a military standpoint at Walter Reed to understand what happened to these POWs who were held by the North Koreans and who were turned inside out, upside down. And they started confessing to crimes they had not committed, becoming propagandists for the North Korean communist regime. And then when they were released, when they came back to the United States, they felt like, in their words, more or less, like they had woken up from a deep sleep, and that something had happened to them to make them change, and no one knew what it was. And so Edgar Schein, Robert J. Lifton studied what happened to these individuals, as did Margaret Singer, and they began to realize that there was a method behind what was going on, that there was a methodology, that it was systematic, it was deliberate, it was orchestrated, and it was tweaked and carefully done. And it didn't involve torture so much as control of the environment, control of information, and these various aspects that Lifton identified. And what Lifton was able to do, if you will, Aaron, he basically popped the hood on what we call brainwashing. And he looked under the hood of this vehicle, and he said, look, these are the components that make it work. These are the parts to identify. And he basically said in his book, in the 22nd chapter, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. So when you are involved in a destructive cult, which I believe Scientology is, in my opinion, as you're exiting, after you get out, you kind of unpack your shit. You know, you take it out and you look at it and you say, you know, everything wasn't bad. There were some good things. I mean, the study tech has some interesting and helpful principles. Nothing revolutionary or a revelation in the sense that no one ever thought of it before, such as I'm reading something, I don't understand what the word is. Stop, look the word up, understand its range of meaning, then reapproach the material and continue reading. That's a good principle.
But Rick, you're telling me that's not unique to Scientology, looking up words in dictionaries?
No, No, I'm telling you that is a principle of learning that is very talked about by many educators.
L. Ron
And
Hubbard didn't invent dictionaries, Rick.
no, but L. Ron Hubbard invented, here's the thing that you have to recognize about Hubbard. He was a genius when it came to constructing this machine. And this machine is still running. It's got a new superintendent, but the machine still works. It still affects people's lives. It still controls people. I mean, look at Tom Cruise. Look at John Travolta. Look at all the shit they have been through with Scientology, and they are still hardcore believers. And in my opinion, that's because the machine works. And when you've reached OT7 or OT8, I mean, you're all in, you're locked in. And as you alluded to, many people, when they leave Scientology, still have this respect for the tech. They say, I mean, David Miscavige, bad guy, in my opinion. L. Ron Hubbard, kind of a kook. But that technology, wow, that's great stuff.
And to be fair, that's not the camp I'm in, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so I would say this is what I think is so important to do when you leave any group that is very authoritarian, very controlling, that manipulated and had undue influence over your life. When you leave, unpack what happened. And there might be some good stuff there that you want to keep, and that were principles that the group taught you that had to do with your daily life, that in your review, you say, hey, I'm going to keep that. But there's a lot of stuff that was all about control and manipulation. And by taking it out and then looking at those 8 criteria of thought reform written by Robert J. Lifton, or fitting it into the 3 stages of coercive persuasion, or understanding it within Conway and Siegelman's explanation of information control, emotional control, you then can realize how they did what they did to you. And it becomes less frightening. And you begin to realize, hey, I get it. And no one can do this to me again, because I can see through them. I can see how they did it, the methods they used. And so I'm aware to the extent that no one can pull that on me, or it's far less likely that someone will be able to pull that on me again.
I love the fact that you made that point. Because in all sorts of programs that have been produced about Scientology, whether we're talking about TV shows or documentaries or even all the videos on YouTube, when I see any responses in the comment section along the lines of, I can't believe anyone would ever fall for this shit, I go, uh-oh, the message wasn't delivered properly. Because I feel like if the message in the story is told properly, you get people who go, oh my God, I can totally see how someone could fall for this. I go, now that's someone who's less likely to get involved in something like this, as opposed to someone being like, oh my God, you have to be a moron to fall for this shit.
Aaron, I always tell people this, and it's kind of redundant, but I'm going to say it again. I have deprogrammed 5 medical doctors. Wow. One was an orthopedic surgeon. One was an anesthesiologist. I have deprogrammed graduates from virtually every Ivy League school in the U.S. Dartmouth, Cornell, Harvard, Yale, UPenn. One man that I worked with and was unable to successfully deprogram had an MBA from Wharton. So and was a very wealthy and successful man. So the idea that stupid people or weirdo people are the people that get caught up in cults, this is just bullshit. Yeah. And if you believe bullshit like that, you've set yourself up. When that cult comes at you, and they're going to come at you through somebody you know, typically, it's going to be a person you trust. It could be a coworker, a family member, an old friend, a romantic interest, and they're going to come and tell you about something that's very innocuous. They're not going to give you the little details. You're not going to have the information you need to make a truly informed decision. And then they're going to pull you in. And that's the nature of getting caught up in a cult. They trick you. They trick you into joining. And the person who's tricking you is tricked. And so they think, hey, this is the greatest thing that I'm sharing with Aaron, is the truth about his negative reactive mind. I mean, he's going to get a handle on so much. It's going to be great for him. I mean, look at Tom Cruise. I mean, do you honestly think that a guy like Tom Cruise, who, number one, I would say is one of the most outstanding actors of the 20th century, a brilliant producer, he's a brainiac. I mean, this guy is a brilliant man, and yet he has been caught within Scientology for decades, and he believes, I think, totally, that it's wonderful, it's fantastic. Like he told Matt Lauer, Matt, you just don't see it, but I see it. And John Travolta, who's gone through a lot with Scientology, who's also a very intelligent guy. He's not a fool, and yet he's still loyal to Scientology through all that he's been through over his son's death, his wife's death, etc. So I think for us to dismiss what cults do and insinuate that somehow the victims are to blame is to grossly misjudge the whole scenario of cults and the whole phenomenon that they represent.
I have seen some people say that this study or that study actually proves that people who join cults have higher than average IQs. And I've always been like, okay. I'm not sure we should be patting ourselves on the back. Like, that seems like going a little too far there. But I'll tell you what, one of the ways, at least, because, Scientology is the only cult that I was in. One of the ways that the tricking is done is almost the way that the KGB managed to trick the CIA back in the day with someone like Aldrich Ames, right? So, like, just to make the analogy, if I read a book about this, and I don't know if the book was correct and if my memory is correct, but one of the ways, so you had like the head of the CIA counterintelligence division was a Russian spy. And one of the ways, so first of all, they had to trick the CIA in the first place in order to putting this person into this position of power. But then they had to strengthen his position. So they had another lower level, the KGB had another lower level KGB spy rat out Aldrich Ames for being a KGB spy, but it was like a double fake here. So they did this knowing that the whistleblower was then himself going to be exposed as a KGB agent, and it was going to look like it was the whole KGB plot to get rid of Aldrich Ames, which then cemented his power because they're like, oh my God, the KGB is trying to get rid of Aldrich Ames. Now we'll never believe anyone anytime they say Aldrich is a spy, because we've already figured out that people who call him a spy are themselves spies. Okay, so with that analogy, L. Ron Hubbard, there's this quote attributed to L. Ron Hubbard, which is an accurate quote. It's from a lecture saying the way you control people is to lie to them. And this quote gets spread around as if L. Ron Hubbard was caught on like a hot mic or something. And you're like, no, he was giving a lecture to Scientologists. He was giving a lecture to Scientologists about how all of these other mental health fields and professionals, and even the deep state, if you will, control you by lying to you. And he was basically saying that's what makes Scientology unique. We deal in truth, with the study of truth, with the study of knowledge. We're knowing how to know. Using Scientology methodologies, you can undo all of the lies that other people are using to control you. And so as a Scientologist, you're like, we can't be the ones being tricked. The guy who's our leader is the one helping us figure out who's tricking us. Right.
Well, it's a great game of bait and switch. You think that you're getting one thing and then you get another. And, this works in car dealerships, in commercial sales. You have the super sale item that you have only a limited amount available, and then people show up at the store or the car lot saying, where is it? I want to get in on that deal. Oh, we sold out. So that's like the old bait and switch con. And I would say that's really at the core of what cults do. They tell you that they're all about self-improvement, about finding the truth, about reaching a higher level of human potential or whatever. But in reality, it's all about taking over your life, controlling you, exploiting you, and doing that not in your best interest, but in their best interest. And by the way, Aaron, that's the way to determine whether or not a group has undue influence over someone. Ask yourself this: when I look at the membership of that organization or group, are people acting against their own best interest, but consistently in the best interest of the leadership or the hierarchy of that organization? So you've got people like, for example, in Scientology, and they're disconnecting from family members, and they're not communicating, probably feeling pretty sad at times, but not sharing that with other people inside the organization. But they're doing something that is not in their own best interest, which is shunning family members, cutting themselves off, isolating them, but it is consistently in the best interest of the group. And so you see that over and over and over again playing out in destructive cults, which is you're looking at people's behavior and saying, why are they doing that? That's not good for them. Why are they going along with that? That's going to hurt them. But if you look at it from the perspective of the leadership, it's in their best interest. For example, there's this dance company called Shen Yun, and they tour all over the United States, and they are essentially an appendage of a group that's been called a cult called Falun Gong, led by this Master Li, the great Master Li. And you have dancers who are working through injuries, according to litigation that's pending and claims that have been made by former members of the dance company. That is that they have really jeopardized their physical well-being by working while injured, or that they have not been paid very well at all and are doing this for a higher purpose. They believe that serves Falun Gong and their spiritual truth. So, what you see are people acting against their own best interest, but acting in the best interest of Master Li and his family, who have become very rich from Falun Gong and the huge amount of cash flowing through Shen Yun.
It is a good business if you can get into it, isn't it?
The cult business, Aaron, is a very good business from the standpoint of making money and getting having power over people and so on. The problem is if you have a conscience. If you're not a sociopath or a psychopath, it's not a good line of work, because you're going to feel enormous pain over the people that you're hurting and the people that you're inflicting all of this torment on. And so I would say, in my opinion, and I think this has been said by a number of people in mental health professionals, that it just seems like the minimum for a cult leader is you got to be a sociopath. And many of them, and I've met them face to face, are in psychopaths. That's the only way that I can describe them. I mean, how do you describe someone like Keith Raniere, who had more than 50 women branded with a cauterizing iron, and he watched video or, whatever.
And he got other women to do it.
And
he had other women doing it.
He got a doctor to do it.
Yeah.
He got a woman who was a DO to actually do it. She later lost her license, her medical license, but she was his devoted follower. And these women would lay on a gurney, and I met many of them. And this DO would use a cauterizing iron with no anesthetic and would engrave this brand on each woman's pelvis. And it was actually the initials of Keith Raniere, not very well disguised, but somewhat disguised. And so what he was doing was branding these women. I mean, what kind of a man does that? In my opinion, a psychopath. And so many of the cult leaders that we've seen are psychopaths. And when L. Ron Hubbard died and they did, the coroner's report, apparently there was a drug in his blood that has been described as a kind of psychiatric medication for, psychosis or mental problems.
Yeah.
So was Hubbard a psychopath? Many people think he was. And at the end, what is the message of L. Ron Hubbard at the end of his life?
Yeah.
I mean, he's described as this kind of Howard Hughes-like character with wild hair and long fingernails. And is this the ultimate end of the tech, that you end up like L. Ron Hubbard? Because in my experience, cult leaders are really duplicating themselves. Their assumption, and they're typically intensely narcissistic, is that I am the most evolved being or the best person on the planet. And I want everyone to be a clone of me. So my technology and what I'm doing is making people over to be just like me because I'm so wonderful. Yeah. And so if the leader is a psychopath and they end up crazy, what are they doing? They're making people into what? Not very nice people.
Yeah.
The end result of their training and what they're doing is to make people over into what they are, which very likely is a sociopath or a psychopath.
Yeah, that's true. L. Ron Hubbard is basically saying, this is what's wrong with everyone because that's what was wrong with me. And, it's funny, one of the tenets of Scientology that makes Scientologists think they are so much better than everything else, specifically psychology and psychiatry, is they have this idea that all these other fields evaluate for you, which L. Ron Hubbard defines that as telling you what is wrong with you. And Scientology provides you the tools to basically figure out what's wrong with yourself in the process of auditing. And something that clicked for me a few days ago is I go, yeah, that's because L. Ron Hubbard spends all of his time outside of the auditing session telling you what's wrong with you so that you can go into the auditing session and you can figure out why that's wrong with you. He's still evaluating for you. He's just doing it in another way.
In my book, there are 2 chapters on Scientology, one about Scientology itself and another, which is a case vignette of me working through a deprogramming intervention with a person that was in Scientology for 27 years. And he was about to go into Sea Org. He had been outside a public member for many, many years. He'd taken courses. He spent a lot of money. He got his wife involved to some extent, his kids, but they didn't go all in. And so Scientology, in my estimation, decided we want him as a Sea Org member. And without exposing who he is, suffice to say, he had special skills that they could use and that would be very useful to them in the organization. And so he was signing his contract, his billion-year contract, and he was going to become a Sea Org member. And they told him, you're going to have to divorce your wife. So he served his wife with divorce papers. And I came in to do the intervention, which was successful. And it was very intense. I mean, his children were crying. His wife was pleading with him. And he thankfully stayed, listened. He could have left. He didn't. And the one thing that really got him was when we really talked in detail about the Purification Rundown. And I said to him, what if the basic assumption of the Purification Rundown is incorrect. And I showed him documentation to dispel the idea that toxins reside in fatty tissues of the body indefinitely, and that is just not science. And he more or less came to the conclusion, well, wait a minute. So you're telling me that the whole Purification Rundown is bogus, because if the toxins aren't residing indefinitely in the fatty tissues of my body, why do I even need the Purification Rundown to leach them out? And so what does that mean? And what I said to him is, it means that L. Ron Hubbard was wrong.
Right.
It means that L. Ron Hubbard in the 1950s or whatever, when he wrote the Purification Rundown and his quaint theory about what it's supposed to do and why it is necessary, he was wrong. And in fact, Narconon wanted to teach this, the principle that toxins, drugs reside in the fatty tissue of the body indefinitely. Narconon wanted to share that with school children in California. And eventually the authorities within the school system said, you can't teach this because we've got parents calling in complaining to us that their children are terrified that at any given moment, these drugs that they've used over their life are going to come out and disrupt their day-to-day life because they're locked into the fatty tissues of the body. They haven't been properly purged, and they're subject to them coming out. And you're teaching these kids that this is reality when science says that's not so. Or after a certain period of time, drugs no longer are evident in the body through drug testing. We know that. And so why are you teaching that? You told us that you're not a religion, you're an anti-drug program. You offered to come in and help the kids for free, and we thought it would be okay, but we did question you. Is this a religion like the Church of Scientology? And you said no. And now we're telling you, don't teach this to the kids. And Scientology's response was, well, but that's what we believe. And so then the school was put in the position of, wait a minute, this is not supposed to be belief-based. That's religion. It's supposed to be factually based. That's helping the kids deal with drugs. And so when I talked about this with this man who had been in Scientology for 27 years, he came to the conclusion that L. Ron Hubbard was wrong. And then once that was the understanding, and we came to that conclusion regarding the Purification Rundown and its false premise, then he said, well, what does that mean? Because I talked to him about Isaac Hayes. And I said, look, Isaac Hayes said that L. Ron Hubbard's truth is the truth forever, that it cannot be adulterated. It's immutable. So what does that mean? Scientology implies science is somehow the basis of Scientology. And yet if science is in direct opposition to Scientology, and Scientology cannot evolve as science does when theories are disproved and you move on to the next theory, and there's new evidence-based, papers that are published in peer-reviewed journals and so on. That premise that Scientology is based somehow on science is false.
Right.
I mean, it's just based on this quaint theory that Hubbard posited that, drugs are the coke you sniffed, the marijuana you smoked, the LSD you dropped. It's in your fatty tissues. Yeah. And we need you to go through this Purification Rundown so that you will be cleaned out. That whole process is based on a false understanding of the body and science has disproven it. So once that cracked, that guy was able to sit back and say, wait a minute, L. Ron Hubbard isn't perfect. He made mistakes, and this is an example of a mistake he made. And if this was a mistake, then what else was a mistake? And he began to open his mind to reevaluating many other things. And that led to him basically breaking out of Scientology.
Wow. For that particular deprogramming, was that an entry point that you were able to make because of what we talked about earlier, of you being certified as an expert witness in Scientology? And that was for, in my understanding, a Narconon related lawsuit that has everything to do with the Purification Rundown.
Well, let me just clarify that I was retained by a law firm. I did not go through voir dire, and I was not qualified in that particular lawsuit because it was settled. So it never went to court. And I truthfully think that the reason that it was settled was that in many of these cases, they just don't want things on the court record. They don't want things discussed in depth, in detail, as to how they use coercive persuasion or thought reform, which is exactly what I was mapping in my report. I was reading the actual training scripts that were received by me through discovery, and I was correlating them to coercive persuasion, to thought reform, to influence techniques, and I was showing how it could be understood in that context. And I think Scientology absolutely did not want that to be part of the court record. And you're right that I used it in that intervention. That is my knowledge of that. But and I, and also I explained to this man, look, I've had many complaints about Scientology that are consistent with what your two children are here crying about and what your wife is so worried about, is that they're very controlling, very manipulative, and that they don't have your best interest, but rather theirs at the foremost front of their mind. I mean, they're not concerned about if you're going to have a happy family. They want you to be a Sea Org member because you have skills that will reduce their bottom line and make their organization more profitable, more smoothly run. And so I think that he, and it was very tough for this guy because he had joined Scientology at a very young age, and he had spent 27 years in Scientology. And so his whole social network of people, they were all Scientologists. And after the intervention was over and he went on with his life, there were 2 or 3 times that he would call me, or his wife would call me, or his sister, and they would say, look, he's going through a rough patch. You need to talk to him. And it was always the same thing. I really like many of the people in Scientology, and he never really explained to them that he had gone through an intervention, and that's why he wasn't going to any Scientology activities or anything, or wasn't actively involved. And it hurt him because the people that he knew in Scientology, he really liked them. They were good friends. But he began to realize that without Scientology, it was very difficult to sustain those relationships. Yeah. And not ultimately tell them that I have given up on Scientology, which he knew would precipitate probably the disconnection policy, that he'd be seen as either a PTS or an SP, and that he would be terminated as a friend. And so he just kind of dealt with that. That was very, very difficult for him. And of course, the only reason that he sat through the intervention was because he loved his family. He loved his wife. He loved his kids. He loved his sister. And his attitude was, And I commend him for this. His attitude was, look, Scientology's fantastic. I love it. And I think it's the greatest thing ever. And I'm not afraid to talk about it because I'm so sure that it's good that I'll sit here and talk. And you know what? Maybe my kids and my wife and my sister will learn something positive about Scientology that might cause them to start, attending more activities with me or taking courses rather than, abstaining and not being a part of this world that I'm in. Yeah. And so he had a very positive attitude, but it was really about his family. And that's the key to so many interventions, is someone who really cares about their family.
Wow. I find it interesting that you were able to use the truth about the Purification Rundown to help get someone out of Scientology by helping them see how this science is not science, it's pseudoscience, it's false, actually. Because whenever I do videos, I talk about the Purification Rundown all the time in my videos, and I give it, a very short description, and I explain how it's all bullshit. The amount of comments I will get saying, actually, science has proved this is true now, is unbelievable.
No, I mean, anybody who has gone through drug testing knows that drugs do not show up positive in drug tests over a period of time. You literally piss them out. The body expels them through your bodily functions. And so they're gone. I mean, there might be a residue in your hair as it grows out, but to the extent that you need to go through saunas and ingest vegetable oil and take large doses of niacin, that this somehow purges them out of your fatty tissues, it's bullshit.
Or even the idea that the fat cell you have right here, right now, is the same fat cell that's there in 10 years. It's like these things regenerate. These things, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but or a biologist, but
the science of drug rehabs, I mean, they're constantly evolving and changing. And that's what I said to this guy. I said, look, what is the nature of science? The nature of science is constant change. We learn more and theories are disproven or they're reinforced, but we keep moving on. And it's evidence-based. It's fact-based. Yeah. It's not about, do we believe that L. Ron Hubbard is a great man and therefore we believe whatever he says. We don't take it on faith. If it's science, it's proven. It's demonstrated.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, how weird is it that an organization called Scientology is not really science-based?
Yeah.
I mean, they want to trade on that kind of claim, but that's really not what they're all about.
Yeah.
They're faith-based. And you ultimately have faith in the founder, faith in L. Ron Hubbard. Yeah. I believe in Hubbard, I believe in the tech, and that becomes your mantra. But I was saying to him, before you sacrifice your family, before you divorce your wife, isolate yourself in Sea Org, and cut yourself off from these people that you love, you need to really revisit this, examine this carefully, make sure that this is a fully informed choice that you're making, because I don't see where the organization Scientology deserves you cutting off your family. It's just not worth it.
Yeah.
And so that's why we examined it.
Yeah. I'll tell you, the way I, as a good little Scientology soldier, reconciled this idea of Scientology, science, religion, was that L. Ron Hubbard worked it all out. L. Ron Hubbard did the sciencing. He did the sciencing, and now it's settled science. I mean, that's not a term they use in Scientology, but also, even beyond considering it settled science, the way I thought about it as a Scientologist and the way others do is that every single auditing session is yet another valid clinical experiment, if you will, on the workability of Scientology. You go in session, you use the auditing command, you see the reaction on the e-meter, the TA goes up during the session, the TA goes down at the end of the session, you get a floating needle, you get a happy pre-clear, and that this anecdotal evidence, I actually, as a Scientologist, thought that anecdotal evidence was the highest standard of evidence.
Let's unpack that. Let's unpack that. Okay, so you can get on Amazon and get a galvanic response measuring apparatus, which is the core of what the e-meter really is. So what is the e-meter actually doing? The e-meter is measuring your nervous response. So
or would it be more precise to say that it's measuring the resistance to the electrical flow?
Right. So your hands get sweaty. You're nervous. It would be a piece of what we call a lie detector or a polygraph. And so the net result is that the auditor, the person that you're working with, is watching that needle. And when it moves, they know you're nervous. So they are soliciting confession. And one of the 8 criterion of Robert J. Lifton's thought reform model is the cult of confession. And that is, there are no boundaries, and the organization pushes you to confess, and they use the confession as a means of leveraging their control and their power over you. So now let's look at Scientology, and this is the genius of L. Ron Hubbard that we're talking about, where I would defer to him in the realm of being a controller, being a so-called cult leader, is that he devised this spiritual counseling, this auditing, as a means of opening people up and finding out what makes them tick. Where are their vulnerabilities? What is, as Scientology says, their ruin? Where is it? Is it their family life? Is it their job? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol? Do they have sexual identity issues? I mean, what is it that is their pain? And I'm going to watch the needle, and when it moves, I know I'm onto something. And then I'm going to drill down into that crack and find out exactly where it goes. And then what am I going to do after that? I'm going to take copious notes, and that's going to go into your PC file, your pre-clear file, and that's going to be reviewed by, the case officer and the ethics officer and everything. And Scientology knows your pain. They know what you're suffering over. They know what your points of pain are that they can use to continue to bring you into their control. But it's really not measuring the negative reactive mind. I mean, they say that subjectively, that's their claim. But what the e-meter is actually doing is showing the auditor what makes you nervous, which gives him so much more of an edge than somebody who's just sitting there like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or some type of counselor who doesn't have a box to look at to know when they're getting close to something.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, I mean, I've done a bunch of Scientology auditor training. I've probably spent thousands of hours playing with an e-meter. And if you and I are ever in the same space at the same time and happen to have an e-meter present, I would love to play with one with you, because I have no question. I know the e-meter does not work the way Hubbard says it works. It's not influenced by the factors Hubbard says it's influenced by, which is basically the body's magnetic field and then the electrical magnetic charge of the engrams and all this shit. But I'll tell you what, palm sweat and conductivity and nervousness, to me, in my experience, fully explains the tone arm going up and down, which, the tone arm just controls the needle. But I'll tell you, I do not know how to explain. By the way, when I say I don't know how to explain something, I don't even mean to imply, therefore, some imaginary fantasy must be the explanation. I just don't know how to explain falls, long fall blowdowns, and floating needles on an e-meter by hand sweat. But even Scientologists are trained that you can influence an e-meter. with motion, with thoughts, with anything. Like Scientologists know you can influence an e-meter. And yet part of the auditor training process is learning how to differentiate between physical influences on the e-meter and an actual real read. And all I'm saying is I don't yet know how to explain what I'm going to call a real read by physical influences. And that doesn't mean I'm substituting some fantastical explanations, but I'm just being honest. I do not know how to explain a real read on an e-meter.
Well, some people can beat a polygraph.
True.
I mean, that is,
and I can beat an e-meter, and I can beat an e-meter.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain techniques, breathing, thought processes. You can beat a polygraph. And that's why polygraph is not conclusive evidence in court.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it may help investigations because they might say, well, would you be willing to take a polygraph test in regards to your involvement in this particular situation? And if the person takes it and they pass and they're not lying, and the investigation might say, well, this person is less likely suspect. But can that be proffered as conclusive evidence in a court of law? No, it cannot. Right. And that's because it can be beat, because people can beat it. And but I just want to get back to one other point, which is, if Scientology is the key, the technology that I need to become a better human being, to become a more successful person, then who would I look to as the person in Scientology who is my model, who is what I aspire to be? I would say I would look to David Miscavige. I would look possibly to, I would look certainly at L. Ron Hubbard. And I would look at the people that I know that are OT7s, OT8s, the people that are at the top of the pyramid, and ask myself, do they exemplify where I want to end up?
Right.
And L. Ron Hubbard was basically living like a very encapsulated, sheltered, almost, really you could describe it as a secret life. I mean, at one point he had to come out, as you recall, to prove that he was really still alive, because people were saying, oh, he's dead. And David Miscavige doesn't really have his agreement, but he wasn't dead. He was alive. And if you remember, I don't know if you probably remember Jerry Armstrong.
I know of him. I've spoken to him. At least once.
Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken to Jerry a few times, and I think what they really were worried about with Jerry Armstrong, and why he received a large amount of money at one point, was because they knew that Armstrong was right there with Hubbard near the end. And so he was a fact witness as to the state of mind, the state of being of L. Ron Hubbard at the end of his life. And so this, I often ask this of people that are in groups called cults. Look at the leader, look at the founder. Is that what you want for your life? So we look at L. Ron Hubbard at the end of his life, and he appears to be experiencing psychosis, disconnected from reality. Was it psychosis? Was it Alzheimer's? Was it dementia? I mean, we don't really know. And there were questionable drugs found in his blood.
Well, how about this? I mean, his wife goes to prison in what, 77, 78, 79, 80. He never sees her again. He never sees his wife again. The last 10 years of his life, he never saw his wife. I think he was, he kidnapped his daughter at one point earlier in life. He was arrested for writing bad checks.
Let's not forget that he also was physically abusive to a wife.
Right.
That came out, that he exaggerated his bio, his CV. He embellished it. So you kind of step back and you ask yourself, well, what kind of a man is this?
Yeah.
Is this what I consider to be a truly evolved being? Is David Miscavige, I mean, if we're to take Mike Rinder's testimony and others, you know, Debbie Cook, that David Miscavige would be screaming and ranting, and that he would bully people, that he would physically attack people. Is this the kind of being we want to evolve to be? I mean, because if the assumption is that Scientology evolves you and that you become increasingly a better person, then these people at the top should be the poster boys for that achievement.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're not, the fact that they seem so dysfunctional, so given to anger and abuse, that is abusing others, that would lead me to believe that the tech did not work for them. So if the tech did not work for them and they're at the top of the tech, how is it going to work for me?
Right.
And I would say the same thing to Nexium members that followed Keith Raniere. I mean, Keith Raniere was a liar. He was a fraud. He was a sex trafficker. He was an abuser. He was the worst example of humanity. And yet he was selling basically Scientology repackaged, because he copied everything practically from Scientology. His courses, his coaching techniques, a lot of it came out of Scientology. Can you believe that within Nexium, if someone was critical, they would be called an SP?
It's crazy.
I mean,
and they have intensives.
So yeah, they had intensives. And what I would say about, again, about Hubbard and Scientology is Hubbard was a genius when it came to creating a machine of control, and how thorough he was, how comprehensive he was, all the redundancies that are built into the machine to keep it controlling people, in my opinion. That was why Keith Raniere copied Hubbard, because why do I need to reinvent the wheel? Hubbard already has the best wheel in town. Let me just copy what's good there. And then he threw in some Ayn Rand. He built in a multi-level marketing thing, because Raniere used to be an Amway distributor. And then there was the kind of seminars that he would have over the weekends that I think he copied from groups like Landmark Education, formerly known as EST, or LifeSpring, or whatever. So Raniere was, interestingly, he sued me for copyright infringement and trade secret violation for exposing or critiquing, by publishing two doctors who wrote critiques of the training offered by Nexium. He sued me for 14 years over putting that online where people could read it, on the basis that I had violated his copyright and his trade secrets, when in fact he was a plagiarist. He copied Hubbard. And then, but the thing about Raniere, and I would say this to people in Nexium, look at Keith Raniere. I mean, he raped a child. He lied about his education. He lied about his personal biography. He lied about his IQ. He lies, and he hurts people, and he's terrible. He's hurt a lot of people. If rational inquiry, which is the title of his philosophy to improve you, if rational inquiry is so perfect, so wonderful, what happened to him? What happened to Keith Raniere? Another example would be Werner Erhard, whose given name was Jack Rosenberg. He came up with this course curriculum, also in part copied from Scientology. I mean, Scientologists would call Erhard a squirrel, and say that he was stealing their tech. So what about him?
There's a whole auditing rundown in Scientology designed to fix people who did EST.
Yeah,
you know that?
I mean that's a good one. but Earhart is another example. I mean, this guy repeatedly divorced, allegations that he beat his wife up, that he treated his children horribly, staff that work with him saying that he was a bully, that he was very similar to the allegations against David Miscavige for the way he treated people like Debbie Cook and others.
Yeah.
So I think that you look at the head of the organization, the founder, the one who's supposed to be this genius that's giving you this technology, and in Landmark Education, their seminar training is referred to as their technology. What about the founder? If it's so great, why didn't it work for him? Why did he keep getting divorced? Why did he keep having the same problems over and over, according to a litany of complaints about him? If the tech works, it should be evident through the founder, right? Yeah. The founder should be this wonderful, evolved person, very benevolent, very accomplished, not given to rants of insanity and constantly bullying people. It should be a very secure, very stable kind of person. That would be the thinking. But that's not what you actually see with these organizations. Yeah. So I would say look before you leap, because what that founder, what that leader is, could be the end result that is built into this organization. Because the founder is so narcissistic, he or she thinks, yeah, I want everybody to be just like me. But what if just like me means I'm making you crazy like me?
Right. I always thought it was interesting that Scientology never took the route of becoming a sex cult like Nexium, like I believe the Branch Davidians did, like I believe the People's Temple did. Even though L. Ron Hubbard was surrounded by all these young girls and young, attractive, Sea Org members. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that Hubbard wasn't all bad. That I think that he himself thought that in some way that he was doing something idealistic, good, that he had limits, that he had boundaries. And that's why I always say that when we talk about destructive cults, there are some groups that are much worse than others. For example, if you were in the Children of God, Aaron, you would say, gee, Scientology is a really nice group. because Children of God is way worse than Scientology historically. I mean, they mandated sexually abusing children in the organization. Women became prostitutes as a matter of following the doctrine of the organization. They would go out and fundraise by selling themselves, literally. And so you had kids that grew up in Children of God that lost their virginity at the age of 4 or 5 and were horribly sexually abused over a period of years. And I've talked to kids that survived that and managed to have a successful adult life. It's amazing that they did accomplish that. But many of them did not, and they would fall into drug abuse, some of them committing suicide, dying from overdoses. For example, River Phoenix, whose parents joined the Children of God, and for a part of his life, he was raised within the Children of God. And in one interview, he said that he lost his virginity at the age of 4, and he died from a drug overdose at the age of 26. So we look at other cults, and this may seem odd, but we can look at a group like Children of God and say, thank you that I was in Scientology and that I wasn't in the Children of God. It could be worse. True. So there are cult leaders like Moses David Berg, who headed Children of God, who molested his daughter, his granddaughter, who horribly mistreated his family and horribly impacted the lives of the families under his control. And he was far worse than L. Ron Hubbard. There were things in Berg that were much darker, just much more malevolent than Hubbard. But I think Hubbard was much more clever than Moses David Berg. And you could argue that there are some cult leaders that are even more clever than L. Ron Hubbard. Mm-hmm. For example, in my opinion, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who basically lived to a ripe old age, died in luxury, was never prosecuted, barely even sued very much.
Is this different than the Rajneeshis up in the Northwest?
This is Transcendental Meditation, TM.
Oh, okay.
David Lynch was a big proponent of TM, and TM has often been called a cult. And Maharishi was the God man, the guru that was at the top of TM. And TM actually accumulated billions of dollars and was far richer than Scientology. Wow. and had much less controversy surrounding it. Had Maharishi had a much smoother, trajectory of a career, of a life. He wasn't under scrutiny like Hubbard. So you could argue that TM wasn't quite as destructive as Scientology, and that Maharishi was not quite as bad as Hubbard, though he was frequently accused of going after the ladies and trying to use his position of power for sexual favors. But, some cult leaders are much worse than others, and some cults are much worse than others. Just like you could be in an abusive, controlling relationship, and your partner could be emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive, gaslighting you, manipulating you, but yet not physically beating you up. I mean, I think Tina Turner would be an example of someone who was beat up repeatedly, very badly. And so there are abusive, controlling relationships that are worse than other abusive, controlling relationships. And there are some cults that are far worse than others. So if you're an ex-Scientologist and you're watching this, say to yourself, gee, I'm glad I wasn't a Waco Davidian or a follower of Jim Jones or Charlie Manson. It could have been worse.
Yeah.
Or this group that we're now looking at called the Zizians.
Yes. Earlier in the interview, I said that as an ex-Scientologist, because of my time in Scientology, I have sort of this baked in bias against the anti-cult space. But as I thought about it a little more, it's actually a bit of an anti-intellectualism, a bias against scholarship and intellectualism that I think was instilled in Scientology. And I think a big part of where this came from was because all of the leading psychiatrists or psychologists who would put out studies or statements or in any way things that were anti-Scientology, Scientology would characterize them as basically hiding behind their position in academia, or hiding behind their scholarship, or using their scholarship, or denigrating their scholarship, or being like, this is this fake army of fake intellectuals, and this is how big psych and big government attack a movement like Scientology. And so, all of the the authors that we've discussed in this chat, I don't know if they're professors or if they're PhDs or anything, but I think because the attacks against Scientology always came from people who were themselves, to a large extent, scholars or in academia or whatever, that it has created this anti-intellectual bias. And so also let's take, for example, what I would have thought about someone like Robert Lifton when I was in Scientology. I would have thought of him as, okay, so you wrote a book, congratulations, that doesn't make you an expert. You could have two people, same experience, one guy writes a book, one guy wasn't, but because you wrote it in a book, all of a sudden you're an expert. And I know that is how Scientologists think about the anti-cult space. Like, oh, yippee, you wrote a book, now you're an expert, now you can shoot off at the mouth and say whatever you want about Scientology, and everyone's going to bow down and act like you're telling the truth, but only a Scientologist knows that you're lying. So this whole field of anti-cult work Is it a field of academic study?
Oh yeah, you know, there's the International Cultic Studies Association where people present and speak on the basis of papers that they've written and research that they've done. And I think we've come a long way in understanding how cults actually work through that kind of research and academic papers that have been published over a period of time. What I tried to do in my book was comprehensively pull together a lot of this information. There are more than 1,200 research footnotes in my book and an 18-page bibliography. So I felt like this will be kind of a way of putting a lot of information into someone's hands so that they can sort through what happened to them. And I would say that regarding Scientology, you have to look at it from a business standpoint. What was L. Ron Hubbard's business? His business was selling people on the idea that Scientology was the ultimate answer to any psychological or emotional problems that were in your mind, that Scientology was the cure-all for the human mind, the human condition. And quite frankly, that there was nothing that could compare to it, that it alone was, and Lifton talks about this in terms of being a sacred science. That's one of his 8 criteria, that there is a sacred science of the organization. And he was writing about this before he even probably heard of Scientology. Lifton's book was published in 1961. So Lifton wasn't thinking about Scientology, but what he would say would apply to Scientology, because Scientology, in my opinion, is using thought reform. So they have a sacred science, something that cannot be questioned, that anyone who questions it must have ulterior motives. They must be wrong. They must be ultimately unscientific, because the group's answers are not only true for individuals in the group, but for everyone, and for the ordering of human existence, as Lifton would say. So Scientology and Hubbard would look at psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health professionals as competition, as a competing group of professionals that would offer alternative answers to people other than Scientology. And so what Hubbard wanted to do was lock down his consumer group and say, basically, look, I'm the only answer. I'm the only truth. And if you go with the psychiatrists, if you go with the psychologists, they have nothing to offer. Everything that you need is with Scientology. It's a one technology that will answer and address all of your problems, be it your family, your individual pain, your work. Everything can be addressed through the utilization of Scientology. And so what Hubbard did very intelligently, very astutely, is he denigrated and dismissed anyone who could potentially compete for his consumer base, for his client base. And I'll never forget what Mark Vicente once said to me. Mark was in Nexium, and before Nexium, he was in a group called the Rantha School of Enlightenment, led by a woman who claims to channel a spirit from 35,000 years ago. Her name is J.Z. Knight. And the group has been called a cult. And so Mark calls me up out of the blue, and he's reading my book, and he says to me, Rick, you know why I called you? I called you because when I was in Nexium, they used to say to me that you were the most evil son of a bitch in the world, that you were just like the worst thing, like a snake, like a scorpion under a rock. You were just out there to hurt people. You're terrible. And when I realized that Keith, meaning Keith Raniere, was a bad guy, I thought, well, maybe the guy that he thought was so bad isn't so bad. So I'm going to call him up. I'm going to talk to him and find out why Keith hated him so much, because he would rant about him and carry on about him, and he sued him and warned us about his websites, his database. It's all lies, you know. So we spent a lot of time unpacking his experience in Nexium. And I would suggest that to anyone that has been in a destructive cult. For example, if you are coming out of Scientology, which I consider, in my opinion, a destructive cult, you might want to look at what people in the mental health profession have to say, at least about Scientology, about its methods of persuasion, of indoctrination. Because if Scientology is bad and you've had a bad experience in Scientology and you're beginning to question whether or not this is a good organization, then wait a minute, doesn't that mean that maybe some of the critics might be right? Because you yourself are beginning to come up with criticism of the organization, things that have happened to you that you feel were wrong, that were very questionable. So if you've gotten to that juncture, why not consider Scientology's critics?
Right.
And part of that would be the wealth of information from the mental health profession. Now, I realize that Scientology instills unreasonable fears in people regarding psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, and so on. But ask yourself this: isn't that a means by which they control people? Yeah. Because if you stigmatize the people that might be able to help you, yeah, and you instill unreasonable fears about them, then that's going to keep people from getting the help they need to realize that they've been conned.
Yeah.
So it's a self-serving kind of point of doctrine.
Totally. Totally. And I've always, in my community, I somehow have a reputation for being anti-therapy. And I'm like, I think you guys have misunderstood. I'm anti the cost of therapy. If it was free, you'd probably never be able to keep me away from the office.
Well, you know, and there you can just simply read, you know, one of the things that I did with my book was I included a history of well-known cult groups. And when I included that history I think it's in about 3 chapters of the book. There's a chapter on growing cult awareness, on small but deadly cults, and on family cults. And then I broke out a chapter about Scientology, a chapter about Falun Gong, a chapter about abusive controlling relationships. But my intent throughout the book, because I'm quoting people who have lived through the experience, I'm quoting people that escaped from different groups and survived. And what I'm doing as I'm building that narrative, going into the chapter on defining a destructive cult and cult brainwashing, is you're hearing those voices. And the idea of hearing them is, why do they sound so much like what I've been through? And if what I've been through in my group, which some people have said is a cult, is very similar to this historical group that everybody agrees is a cult, like, for example, Jonestown, the followers of Jim Jones, who were either murdered or killed themselves in 1978, and almost 1,000 people died. We pretty much all agree, well, gee, that was a pretty bad cult. And there are other groups that I mention in the book, and I have this narrative that I build, which is of the voices of the victims, the voices of the survivors. And what I'm asking people to consider is, if what they say resonates with you, and you're saying, well, that's how I feel, that's what happened to me, something like that happened to me. What does that mean? Yeah. That means that you probably were in a destructive cult or in an abusive, controlling relationship, or a very, very questionable multi-level marketing scheme that was manipulating you. So hear those voices and let that be a kind of window into understanding the cult phenomenon as a whole, because there are these common threads that pull through all these groups, which again is this absolute authoritarian leader who has no accountability, becomes an object of worship, and is the defining element and driving force of the group. Do you have somebody like that running your group?
Yeah.
I mean, how are they accountable? What are the checks and balances? And number two, when you read through Lifton and you're going through those 8 criteria, do they resonate with what you're experiencing in your group? Did you go through breaking sessions like Edgar Schein describes in Coercive Persuasion? And then were you socially isolated to reinforce the indoctrination subsequent to the changing phase? If you went through that, again, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it just might be a duck. But a lot of times I'll talk to people and they'll say, well, no, it's an elephant. Okay, well, you can say that, but as things unfold and you in some way are negatively impacted by the group, you're exploited by the group, you're taken advantage of, you might want to consider these stories, these narratives, so that you can essentially think your way out, because that's the key. You want to be able to critically think, to unpack your experience, look at it more objectively, step away from the group, unplug long enough so that you don't hear the group chattering in your head, and you can think on your own, possibly bounce it off of people that are outside of the group so you can get more accurate feedback, again, that's more objective and not connected to the group and invested in the group. And then you literally can think your way out. And that's the key.
Yeah. You know, when I'm a guest on other podcasts to talk about Scientology, and well, I've been a guest on a lot of podcasts, but the two that I've been on that are both the biggest and where the hosts are like legitimate scholars or members of academia would be Lex Friedman and Jordan Peterson. And they will ask me, in your opinion, is Scientology a cult? I go, yes. And they go, why do you feel Scientology is a cult? And I go, you know what? I'm not an academic, and I don't know how an academic would answer that question. But I'm going to tell you the reason I say Scientology is a cult is because of how it destroys families. My family was destroyed by it. Hell, L. Ron Hubbard's family was destroyed by it. Tom Cruise's family was destroyed by it. David Miscavige's family has been destroyed by it. Whatever an academic would say it is about Scientology that then allows it to destroy families. As far as I'm concerned, I go, I'm a layman. I don't have to concern myself with the scholarly answer. The answer is, the reason I talk about it is because of how it relentlessly destroys families. Do you think there's space for, I guess, what's my real question here? I've never even wanted, I wanted to stay in my own lane on this conversation as far as just talking about it from my experience and not trying to represent the scholarly or academic, because I'm not a member. That's not my lane. I haven't read all the books. I don't read the studies on this subject. And yet it's still a subject I really enjoy talking about, Scientology. And I want to get out the word at how Scientology is, I call it a destructive human trafficking cult that tears apart families. And I've really kind of honed in on that messaging. Do you think that messaging is helpful, even though I'm not engaging in the greater scholarly conversation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, because that is one of the most primary reasons why people come to me and say, I want to do an intervention. They're not coming to me because of an academic understanding of the group. They're coming to me because it's hurting their family, it's tearing their family apart, and they're worried about someone they really love and care about. And so that's the motivation behind interventions. Another thing that I think haunts a lot of people, and people want to know this, is, does the leader of the organization actually believe their own hype?
Hmm.
And I don't think Keith Raniere did. In
Ah.
my opinion, he was a con man. And I have to say, based on my reading of L. Ron Hubbard, I don't know that L. Ron Hubbard truly believed in the tech.
I want to
In
talk to
my
you about that.
in my opinion, he knew that he was running a con. Now, David Miscavige may have grown up believing totally in everything, but I think that there may have been a moment of clarity or a point in his life after he assumed the position of leadership that he now has occupied for many years as virtual dictator for life of Scientology. I think there must have been a point when you reach the top of the pyramid and you can look at the whole structure and you're in charge and you know what you're doing to cover this up or fix that problem, that you know that it isn't as presented. And so I strongly suspect that David Miscavige may not be a true believer. But boy, I'm telling you, there sure are a lot of people that are. And I think that Tom Cruise is, and I think John Travolta is, I think Jenna Elfman is. There are a lot of people in Scientology that earnestly, truly believe in it. And they honestly feel like they're helping to clear the planet and they're going to make this a better world. But I question that when you get to a certain level in an organization, you can see everything and you have knowledge of everything that's going on, all of the details of daily operations, that you don't begin to realize and come to the realization that this really is a scam. I mean, this is about taking advantage of people, exploiting people, and covering it up. And I know that because I'm in charge. I know every space of this organization, whoever the leader is. And I think L. Ron Hubbard was in the know. And it would seem to me that David Miscavige is also in the know.
Yeah. You know, with L. Ron Hubbard, he seems to me to be, and I've known other people like this in my life, someone who's incapable of telling even a true incredible story without lying about it to make it even more incredible. Yeah. It's like if you the book about L. Ron Hubbard's life, Barefaced Messiah, if you just took what his real life story was, it would be pretty damn incredible. But he was also an inveterate pathological liar. So like incredible wasn't good enough.
Well, you know, this is what I see in cult leaders over and over and over again. So it's almost like I'm meeting the same person in a different body. So it's just like, you know, typical cult leader, intensely narcissistic. I mean, go down the basic behavior of someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, and you're looking at someone who fits also the description of a cult leader. They seem incapable of empathy. They have sympathy only for themselves. They will see themselves as a victim, but they don't see any of the people they hurt as victims. They must always be right. They're never wrong. If anyone even insinuates that they're wrong, and it can be something quite minor, they just go into a rage at times. That they're constantly gaslighting people, that is, manipulating people deliberately, saying things to diminish people's sense of self-esteem. You know, or if you're a cult leader like L. Ron Hubbard, you can actually build into the machine the so-called technology of breaking down self-esteem, breaking down a person's sense of self-reliance, of independence, and instead engendering dependency upon you and upon the organization. And this issue of being a pathological liar is very common amongst cult leaders. It's just one more example of how they kind of stack up in their typical profile. and some of them are sociopaths, and many of them are psychopaths. I remember one time I was disagreeing with another cult expert who said that David Koresh was not a psychopath. Well, actually, what he said to me is, I have a plan to deprogram David Koresh. This was during the Waco Davidian standoff in the early 90s, and I was tapped by the BATF and the FBI before and during the standoff because I had actually deprogrammed Waco Davidians under Koresh's control successfully. Wow. So this person who also did intervention work said to me, well, I've got a plan to deprogram David Koresh. And I said, you can't deprogram a cult leader. They weren't programmed in the first place. He is a psychopath. And this person said, well, Rick, you're not a mental health professional, which is true. And he said, you can't say that he's a psychopath. Well, I called Margaret Singer because I was concerned. And of course, she was one of the seminal clinical psychologists that work with so many former cult members, including Patty Hearst, who was famously kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army in the 70s and brainwashed by them. So I talked to Margaret and I said, what do you think? Is David Koresh a psychopath? And Margaret said, of course he's a psychopath. Rick, they're all psychopaths. and then Jolly West, who was a psychiatrist and one of the top academics in the field, worked at UCLA. He later came out in an article interview and said David Koresh certainly is a psychopath. So what you find again and again is this same type of personality profile that is the cult leader, which is at bare minimum a sociopath, given to lying pathologically, exaggerating their prowess, their success, embellishing their CV, so to speak. And then it escalates to where the person can be a psychopath.
Yeah.
And in the case of leaders like David Koresh and Moses David Berg and Keith Raniere, sexual predators and pedophiles.
Yeah. I'm curious, and this is an interesting little segue. We won't spend more than a couple of minutes on it. In this day and age, with people, particularly in the media, throwing around mental health or mental sort of diagnosis labels like whether it's a psychopath or narcissist or whatever. Do we live in a day now where someone like a Margaret Singer, it might even be problematic though for her to say that someone she's never seen or treated is a psychopath? Is that what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what you would do is you would look at that person's biography, their behavior, the things that they have stated publicly, statements that they've made, and you would then compare that to the profile of a psychopath. Okay. An example would be David Koresh raped Carrie Jewell when she was 10 years old. How did he act? How did he respond to that? What did he say about that? Was that response, were those statements, was that behavior consistent with a psychopath, a sociopath, a narcissist? How would you correlate that? So you can look at the behavior. Of course, you would like to, I'm sure Margaret Singer would prefer to sit down with someone who is being considered to be possibly a psychopath, interview them, test them, etc. But you can look at the behavior of people. I think you can look at the behavior of Charles Manson, for example. He was a psychopath. You can look at the behavior of Jim Jones, psychopath. And Shoko Asahara, the leader of Aum Shinrikyo, who gassed the Tokyo subway system, psychopath. I mean, a lot of these cult leaders, psychopaths,
Right.
some of them much more destructive than others. So there are, and let me just say this: there are some cult leaders who just want the money. They just want to make a lot of money, and so they take advantage of people financially. They sell them a bag of goods, and they are very happy to become multimillionaires in the process. And they're not really that malevolent. And that's why I say some cults can be much worse than others. And you can say to yourself, gee, I'm glad I was in Scientology instead of the Waco Davidians, because they're all dead. Or Marshall Applewhite's group, Heaven's Gate, where they all died in the end with Marshall Applewhite. So there are some groups much worse than others. And I think that you can give yourself a pass and say, okay, yeah, all right, I was in Scientology. And especially if you were brought in as a child and you were raised in Scientology, I think you can give yourself a pass and say, look, I mean, I was just born into this group. That's how I got in. And you can also maybe give your parents a pass and say, look, given what I now know about cult indoctrination and control, my parents they did what they felt was good for me, and they were under undue influence. Yeah. So I think that what you want to do as you're exiting a cult is contextualize everything that happened, put it into context with other groups, and realize that you're not the only one, and read about other people that have survived even worse cults, and recognize, that you have common ground with them, and that you can learn from their experience and what they have done to recover.
Yeah. Can I give you a few more words on the subject of L. Ron Hubbard believing his own BS and see what you think about this? So back in the early days of Dianetics, and when you look at the letters he wrote to the publisher of Astounding Science Fiction, building the hype on all this, and when you look at the early commercial success of Dianetics and the research foundations and all the, like, it was a huge moneymaker in the early days, before it all went bust, and then he had to create Scientology. It definitely seemed like L. Ron Hubbard thought Dianetics could replace psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. It definitely seemed that way. I mean, he went so far as to offer it to the APA and the AMA, and then he was rejected, and everything rolled forward from there. Yeah. And then when you're studying Scientology and you're listening to thousands of hours of L. Ron Hubbard detailing meticulous auditing procedures, and I'm not exaggerating when I say tens of thousands of pages about the proper administration of an auditing session and the various auditing grades and levels, and you go, it is impossible to go through all that and come out the other end thinking that this guy did not believe his own bullshit. And but what I'm just, when I say impossible, I just mean, it might be possible from someone exterior to it to be able to see how it's true, but personally going through it, it's almost impossible. But what I really want, the story I really wanted to tell, and stop me if you've heard this story, is, for those last years of L. Ron Hubbard's life where he was in seclusion, there was only a handful of people with him ever. One of those guys is a man by the name of Sarge, who was kind of like groundskeeper, caretaker, handyman for everything. L. Ron Hubbard in his later years was obsessed with getting rid of his body thetans, and that he had never succeeded in getting rid of all of his body thetans. Now, on the upper confidential Scientology levels, as you probably know, you learn about these, what L. Ron Hubbard calls body thetans, alien, kind of like half-dead, sick, diseased alien souls that were brought to Earth, blown up in the volcanoes with the hydrogen bombs. They've been blowing in the winds ever since, and they attach to us by the tens of thousands, and everything that's wrong with them is projected onto us, and it becomes what's wrong with us. And the upper Scientology levels on OT3, you start telepathically getting rid of your body thetans. On OT4 and 5, more telepathically getting rid of your body thetans. OT6 is a course where you learn on OT7 to get rid of the rest of your body thetans. And OT7 is supposed to be the last level that involves getting rid of body thetans. OT8 involves going through all of your past life recalls and figuring out which one of those recalls were really yours and which one of them belonged to your body thetans. As you know, OT8 is the highest Scientology level. every level above that is not supposed to be about getting rid of body thetans. And L. Ron Hubbard finished. Okay, so but then in the last years of his life, he was so obsessed with continuing to have to get rid of body thetans that, according to Sarge, L. Ron Hubbard asked Sarge to build a high voltage version of the e-meter that L. Ron Hubbard could use the shock to blast off all the body thetans from his body and kill his body so that he could permanently exteriorize from his body free of the body thetans. Now, if that doesn't scream, I believe my own bullshit, I don't know what.
Aaron, let's look at it from the perspective of Occam's razor, a scientific principle that the most obvious explanation is usually correct.
Okay.
So L. Ron Hubbard, what is he? He's a science fiction writer. So the myth, the story that animates Scientology about Xenu and intergalactic federations and beings and all of this, it reads like science fiction, which is what L. Ron Hubbard was. He was a science fiction writer. So I find it hard to believe that the most obvious explanation isn't true. He wrote a science fiction story that becomes the creation myth of Scientology. And he knew that he was making it up. He knew that he knew that Xenu was something that he created, that body thetans was something that he created, the volcanoes, the spaceships that looked like airplanes and whatnot, the implausible stories that he concocted to animate his belief system that he proposed would, clear the planet. I think that he knew that it was, in my opinion, I think he knew it was bullshit. I think he knew that this is science fiction. I'm writing it. I'm a science fiction writer. But I think that whatever happened to Hubbard towards the end of his life was pretty bad. I mean, he psychologically, emotionally broke down. That's why it appears to me he was in seclusion. He was in seclusion because if the rank and file of Scientology saw this guy at that point in his life, they would be shocked. And they would go, whoa, that's LRH?
But you don't think he was in seclusion hiding from the lawsuits and governments?
I think towards the end, it was more about, we do not want this man in public. Because the guy that is described by Jerry Armstrong and other people, the guy on the ranch out there, I guess near Santa Barbara, is this guy that looks like eerily like a reclusive Howard Hughes.
I think the photo you're talking about is the one where he was hiding out in the Bronx for about 6 months and he had the long hair and the suspenders.
No, but I mean, towards the end, he's ranting, he's running around, carrying on. He has these what appear to be paranoid delusions,
right? And
so you want to, and of course, what is at the core of these paranoid delusions is his religion that he created. So, ironically, he is terrorized by the religion that he created. Yeah. So he's afraid of body thetans. He wants to get rid of them because this is what he's written about and preached for so long. And it becomes this becomes the demons that are pursuing him at the end.
Right.
It's almost poetic.
Well, it sounds like we're almost saying the same thing, because because I guess what I'm speculating about is whether his mental state deteriorated to a point where he basically started to believe what had been his fiction.
I think that is a fair assessment, in my opinion. And the overarching question is, if Scientology is the ultimate technology of the human mind, and L. Ron Hubbard is its ultimate practitioner and an all-knowing creator, why did it fail Hubbard?
Right.
Why does he end up on meds? Why does he end up in the coroner's report having medications in his bloodstream? Why is he in seclusion? Why is he ranting about body thetans and seems to be having paranoid delusions? If Scientology is the cure-all that is being claimed, why couldn't it medicate his mind? Why couldn't that be the solution that would take away his mental anguish, his pain at the end? And the fact that it didn't or couldn't, what is that? What does that tell us?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, it's very ironic that he would be so terrified of body thetans in the end. It's like he was overwhelmed by his belief system that I think he knew that he manufactured it. Mm-hmm. I find it very difficult to believe that a science fiction writer whose stock and trade was writing, this pulp fiction, science fiction, that this was not concocted by him as the ultimate science fiction story that he would use to animate this thing called Scientology. I mean, when you reach OT3, for those people that don't know, when you reach OT3, that's when the story is shared, and you find out about Xenu and the body thetans and everything. And I think that's because Hubbard knew that it was not true. And I think it's because he knew that it was such a fanciful and bizarre story to explain the human condition and the planet and everything, that people would not accept it if they were initially presented that story. So in other words, Mimi Rogers, Tom Cruise's first wife, mm-hmm. if she said, "Hey, Tom, I want you to get involved in Scientology. My parents are involved in it. I was raised in it. It's really cool. Would you like to get involved in it?" And I think that if Tom Cruise looked at her and said, "Mimi, what's it all about?" And she said, "Well, you know about, Jesus and Mary and God, the Father and the Holy Spirit. Well, let me tell you about Xenu and the Intergalactic Federation and the spaceships and body thetans." I think if she had told that to Tom Cruise at the very beginning, he would have said, "Mimi, you're nuts." That is the craziest story I ever heard. I mean, people have told me that the story of the virgin birth and Jesus and all of that is very hard for them to believe. But that story coming from you and me being a Catholic, because that's how Tom Cruise was raised, I think your story is more implausible than the one I was raised on. And I am not going to buy into Scientology. And so on that basis, I think that's why Hubbard organized Scientology, constructed it, so that you do not find out what the story is until you reach operating Thetan level 3, OT3, because he needs all of that indoctrination, all of that auditing, all of those training cycles, those exercises. What do you see? I see an ashtray. What do you see? I see the wall. He needs to break people down, to unfreeze them, as Shine would say, in order to get them to a point where he can then change them and then lock them in. Yeah. And they're not going to be ready to accept this very bizarre science fiction story to explain the human condition until you've had quite a bit of time to work on them. And then they will be so overwhelmed by the indoctrination, by the process, that they will be willing to accept whatever you present.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the explanation for why Scientologists are not put off by L. Ron Hubbard's history as a fantasy author? Have you heard it?
No, I haven't. Why is that?
Okay. Well, Scientologists believe that L. Ron Hubbard was the reincarnation of Buddha and was born with full and total perfect recall of his last 76 trillion years. And that the reason he was such a prolific writer of these fantasy and sci-fi and Western stories is that they weren't stories. He was writing from his perfect recall of things that actually happened in previous lifetimes, whether it was on this planet or other planets or other solar systems or other galaxies or even other universes. And that's why you'll hear, I don't even know if this is true, but you'll hear L. Ron Hubbard never wrote a second draft. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, but if Scientologists think it's true, it's like, yeah, you wouldn't have to write drafts because you're just writing from your perfect eidetic recall of all of your previous lifetimes. And that is literally how it's explained in Scientology.
Well, I would say that this is consistent with some of the basic narratives of all of the cults that I've dealt with, which is that the leader, whatever the leader has to say about himself or herself, it's always self-aggrandizing. It's always to make them bigger than life. It's always to empower them. You're not going to hear them say, "I am the reincarnation of Jack Schmidlap, the janitor at the Y." You know, it's no, I'm the reincarnation of Marilyn Monroe. I'm the reincarnation of Buddha. I am great. And my narrative, my story is how great I am, how powerful I am, how you should acquiesce to my great wisdom and so forth. And it goes to, you know, this constant, consistent theme, which is whatever I do or say, look at how it empowers me. Look at how it gives me power.
Yeah.
And then also, I like what I control. I don't like what I don't control. So if you kind of look at those two consistent patterns, the self-aggrandizement, which empowers the leader and gives the leader authority, and the fact that the leader doesn't like what he doesn't control, but is okay with what he does control, then you can see consistency in the group. Because I'll never forget one time I was deprogramming a guy who was in a Bible-based group, very fanatical group, and they literally told him to burn his music. At that time, I think he had cassettes. That was before CDs, if you can imagine.
I remember.
So it was before downloading and before CDs. So he had these cassettes, and he built a fire, and he threw them in, and he destroyed his music collection. But later, he was making music, rock music, for the group, and he was taping their music, distributing it, and so on. And he looked at me at one point in the intervention, and he said, "Rick, I don't get it. Why do they hate this music?" And they told me they hated this music. It was satanic, and I burned it. But then I ended up making music for them and taping it and distributing it. And it was very similar. It was rock, but they didn't want to burn it. They wanted to distribute it. How do you explain that? And I said, well, they like what they control, and they don't like what they don't control. They control the music that they make, and it's for their purpose. But the music that is outside of their control, they see it as evil because they don't control it. Right. So what they control, they like. What they don't control, they don't like. And I think if people look through that lens at an organization that's very authoritarian and very controlling, you can begin to understand why they do what they do. Because sometimes you'll see them do things that seem to be inconsistent. But when you look at it from the vantage point of control and empowering the leadership, then you begin to see a consistent pattern.
Interesting. Okay, last subject, deprogramming. Okay, deprogramming is the big boogeyman in Scientology. It's akin to psychiatry in Scientology. And it is such a dirty word. It's like, it's up there right alongside Nazi. Okay, deprogramming, deprogrammer. And just the way Scientology wants people to believe that what psychiatry is everyone's being lobotomized and given electroshock therapy. That's what Scientology wants everyone to think. That's what mental health is. It's lobotomies and electric shocks. They want so that's the big boogeyman in mental health, but deprogramming was such a dirty word. And as a Scientologist, we were basically told that deprogramming is being kidnapped, being confined, and essentially North Korean brainwashing, but to get people out of cults, and that it's actually like a human rights violation. It's actually a crime. Deprogrammers go to jail. They break the law. What can you tell us about deprogramming back then, or what this similar thing is today? Is there any truth to what Scientology was saying about deprogramming, deprogrammers? What are your thoughts?
Well, back in the 70s and in the 80s and going up to about 1990, 91, 92, there were involuntary deprogramming interventions. And that is that families realized that they could not access their loved ones, that parents would have a son or a daughter in a particular cult. They couldn't visit them. They couldn't see them, particularly if they raised any critical questions about the group, that they were cut off. This would happen to people in Scientology Sea Org, where families felt frustrated. They couldn't visit a son or a daughter that was in Sea Org very easily. They had to go through quite a labyrinth of filters before they could talk to them or see them. So having that kind of frustration, families would hire PIs, they'd locate somebody, they'd hire a team, they would then abduct them, hold them against their will, but they were not really kidnapped because they weren't being held for ransom, and they weren't being threatened with death if certain conditions weren't met or whatever. In fact, it was their own family that was holding them against their will in order to have a period of time, 5 or 6 days or whatever. Typically, it would be, I would say, anywhere from 3 to 6 days. That would be a deprogramming session or succession of days, to just talk about what the family was worried about, why the family was concerned about a particular group or leader, what their concerns were. And they would abduct their family member because they felt that there was no other way to have time with them because the group would not allow it. Now, having said that, I participated in some of these involuntary deprogrammings back in the late 80s up until 1990. And back then, which would be 35 years ago, I stopped because, quite frankly, people were being arrested and people were being sued. And I was sued by Kendrick Moxon, who basically recruited a young man that I had tried to deprogram. It was an unsuccessful intervention. He went back to a group, not Scientology, and Kendrick Moxon encouraged a local prosecutor to file criminal charges against me. I went through a criminal trial. I was acquitted by the jury. Then Kendrick Moxon became this young man. His name is Jason Scott. He became his attorney, and I was sued into bankruptcy until Jason Scott decided to leave the group that his mother considered a cult. And he reconciled with his family, and then he sold me a judgment that was $2.5 million for $5,000 in cash, on condition that I agree to deprogram his wife from the group that he had left.
What?
We were never able to meet with her, and so I was never able to fulfill that part of our settlement agreement. But Jason went on to say that Kendrick Moxon and Scientology had used him to go after me and go after an organization called the Cult Awareness Network, which was also bankrupted. I very luckily survived that bankruptcy. And from that time forward, I have not done involuntary interventions. So every intervention that I do, and I've done over 500, are with the cooperation and the consent of the person that I'm working with, and it's done in the presence of their family. And what a deprogramming intervention really is it's education. And it's not really counseling, it's not therapy, it's education. Because a therapist cannot have the goal of getting someone out of a particular group. A therapist needs to be neutral, needs to be objective. When you're doing an intervention, whether it's for drug or alcohol or cults, you do have a goal, which is to get the person to stop abusing substances or leave this group that is a destructive cult or very, very unhealthy group or relationship. So what is done in the process of a deprogramming intervention is basically 4 blocks of information are explored. One is what is a destructive cult? What is an abusive controlling relationship? How is it defined? What are those defining characteristics and points? And do they in any way parallel where I'm at right now, the group I'm involved with, the person that I'm in a relationship with, the multi-level marketing scheme I'm submerged in? Second, what is coercive persuasion? What is thought reform? How does it work? What are the various parts of it? How would I be able to tell that someone was doing that to me? What would it sound like? What would it be like to be involved in that? And you're bringing out examples of different cults, different situations, so that you can document and factually confirm the characteristics that you're talking about. And then number 3, what information is there that you don't know that you should know about the group that you're involved in? Are they hiding information from you? Are they keeping secrets from you? Don't you feel that you would be better off to be more fully informed so that you can make a more informed decision about whether or not you wish to continue with the group? And so you're bringing out research material, for example, with Scientology, research about L. Ron Hubbard, about David Miscavige, about people that were treated badly in Sea Org, about Narcanon, about the Purification Rundown, about the e-meter, about keeping files on people, and so on. You're bringing all that out and you're talking about it with the person in an effort to more fully inform them so that they can make a more informed decision. And then finally, the 4th block of discussion is, why did your family decide to do an intervention? What was it that prompted them? What was it that caused their concern? And the family is always there throughout the intervention to encourage the person to participate and at times to be eyewitnesses to things that have happened. And then ultimately to say, this is why we're worried. And so you take those 4 blocks, defining a destructive cult, explaining coercive persuasion and thought reform techniques, research about the group or individual leader in question, and then finally, what are the family's concerns? Those are the 4 blocks, and you're talking about that over a period of usually 3 to 4 days consecutively. And you're asking the person to unplug from the group during that time. And why is it different from North Korea? Why is it different from cult brainwashing? Well, because I'm not asking them to be my follower. The parents aren't even saying, you must be what I want you to be. You must be a Roman Catholic. You must be a Protestant. They're only making their concerns known about the group, the leader that is in question. And they're raising really legitimate concerns, or I wouldn't be there, about why they're worried about their involvement in this particular group or relationship. And so I'm not recruiting. I'm not going to say, hey, come on, I'm flying back home and I want you to be my follower for the rest of your life. And the family isn't even demanding that that individual adhere to their religion or their political party or whatever. What they're really asking them to do is to think independently, critically, and to literally consider all these things, which will help them to think their way out.
Right.
And you're asking them not for the rest of their life, not to be indentured servant forever. You're asking them for 3 or 4 days to be with their family, to be with their spouse, their adult children, and think things through very carefully. And then the understanding is at the end of that time, they're going to do whatever they want to do. And that's up to them. So they will continue with the group, as probably about what I would say about 3 out of 10 people that I work with will ultimately say, never mind, I'm going to be in this group. Or they'll bail in the first day or the second day and say, I don't care. I love this group. I'm staying with it. But 7 out of 10 will stay the course. They'll continue to talk during the 3 to 4 days. They'll hear what their family has to say. They'll look at all the research material and the literature that has to do with thought reform, coercive persuasion, cults, etc. And at the end, they'll say, gee, I really think I'm going to take a break. Yeah. I'm going to take a break from the group. And they typically don't go back. In some cases, people that have left that I would count in the 3 out of 10 that the intervention is a failure, like Jason Scott, they will consider what was discussed in the intervention. And maybe it might take a year or 2 years or 3 years until something happens in the group that causes them concern. And then they'll reflect on what they learned during the intervention. And that may help them to exit the group. Right. So that's really it in a nutshell. That's what goes on. It's a discussion. It's very educational. It involves reviewing, scientific research, witness statements from different groups and so forth, maybe looking at a documentary or two. And the person is stimulated to critically think.
That's really good to understand that, because I and my fellow board members, we run the SPTV Foundation that helps people that are leaving Scientology. We also just help former Scientologists in various ways. Oftentimes I'll be asked the question, how do you get someone out of Scientology? And I go, oh, no, we don't do that. And they're like, what do you mean? I go, no. We don't do that. We ourselves have already traveled that path. There are major life consequences and ramifications for leaving Scientology. We're not here to encourage people to do that. We're here to help people when they've decided to do it. We're here to help people in that path. But here's the difference. You are helping people at the request of their families. We are helping people who, generally speaking, when they leave Scientology, are going to lose their families. And those are two different things. Oh. And so the way I view things is I'm here to put information out there so that when people are exploring their path out of Scientology, they have a lot of good material to review. I'll talk to someone endlessly. I'll answer a million questions. I'll give them my opinions, but I'll also be very upfront with them. I said, no. I'm not here to convince you or twist your arm to leave Scientology. I'm here for you to be someone to talk to, because when you're in Scientology and you want to leave, there's no one to talk to. I'll answer all your questions. I'll give you anecdotes. I'll share my experiences, and I'll give you all of the confidence that when you make your decision, we will help you in any way, but we are not going to get you. We're not going to push you to make a decision. And I'm curious if you feel like that's a valid form of assistance.
Well, of course. I mean, because most people leave cults on their own.
Mm,
Most people do not leave cults as a direct result of an intervention.
mm,
Deprogramming accounts for a very small fraction of former cult members. What typically happens is something occurs in the group that shocks the person. And they think, gee, I need to step away. I need to give myself space. I'm shocked by what I saw in the group. Or they could feel that they're just worn out. Like I talked to one Sea Org member who physically collapsed, and they took him to the hospital. And the doctor said, "What are you eating?" And he described to him what he was eating. And he said, "How much are you sleeping?" And he told him, and he said, what is your daily work like? And he explained it. And the doctor said, "You're suffering from exhaustion. My advice to you, stop doing what you're doing, get enough sleep, get proper diet, don't work so much, and rest, and you will recover."
mm.
And so the guy left Sea Org, and probably Sea Org felt, he's going to keep collapsing, let him go, or whatever. But he left because he collapsed. And then he very slowly began to sort out what had happened in Sea Org and what he felt about Scientology. And over the years, he would be in touch with me, and he would have increasing clarity over a period of time. And that's why I wrote my book, Cults Inside Out, because I wanted people to have the ability to have clarity more easily, more comprehensively, where they could read a book or listen to a book, Audible or whatever, and understand what happened to them within the context of what has happened to many, many other people in groups called cults. And the book goes into the intervention process and has examples, case vignettes, like the Scientology case that I discussed with you, with the man who was in for 27 years. That is a case vignette within my book. So what I wanted to do was explain to people how deprogramming actually works in real time, give them examples in detail, so that, if you will, you could deprogram yourself.
Mm.
You could start in the beginning and work through the chapters, and it could be a kind of self-help deprogramming where you pay very little and you do it yourself with the assistance of the footnotes, the bibliography, and then you can drill down as deep as you want, depending on what your needs are and what your issues are. But that was my thinking when I wrote the book, because I realized that so few people are going to come out of a group on the basis of my work. It may sound like a lot that I've done over 500 interventions, but what is that in comparison to the millions of people that are involved in cults?
Right.
It's a drop in the bucket. So the overwhelming majority of people walk out. The issue is, and you're tackling it, and I think that's a wonderful thing, is, okay, you left, and maybe you feel like shit, and you're beating yourself up. You're saying, how could I get involved in that? Or why did I stay so long? Or blah, blah, blah. And you're beating yourself up and you feel horrible. And what you're doing, and what I think a lot of people are trying to do through education and recovery programs, is help people that have left to recognize that it's not their fault, that you didn't do anything wrong. And, it's the predator. It's the leaders. It's the cult. It's not about you doing something wrong. It's about what they did to you. And putting that in context and understanding that so that you can move on with your life. I mean, and you're doing that through your work. And I try to do that, through my book, and also through the database culteducation.com, which is just a huge database, probably the largest a single database with information about Scientology.
Wow.
I've been archiving research papers and articles since 1996. So there's like all that information. Every month, the Scientology section grows. Other sections are added depending on what groups come up on the radar. And I think recovery from cults, the most crucial single ingredient is education and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I could not agree more. I'll tell you what, holy crap, it's been over 2.5 hours. This has been a real blast. This has been a lot of fun. I'd like to, if things come up in the future and I got some, specific questions that require cult expertise, I'd love to be able to chat with you again in the future if you're open to it.
Sure. No problem. And just look at it this way. I am involved with Scientology, whether I like it or not. I mean, they've made that very clear to me over the years. If you don't care about us, we sure care about you. And I've been designated an SP for an awfully long time, decades. I think I was probably labeled as an SP maybe before you were born.
Probably.
So I am always available. If something comes up, let me know.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.